So, welcome back to Age Wisely Atlanta. Today, I'm joined by an incredible guest, Attorney Raina Nadler, an experienced attorney specializing in probate law, estate planning, elder law, guardianship, and special needs planning. What truly sets her apart is her deep commitment to serving families, combined with her background in gerontology, which gives her a unique perspective on the challenges that seniors face. She's also a skilled probate litigation attorney, helping families navigate complex estate disputes. And today we're diving into some topics including what happens when someone wants to disinherit an heir and how probate litigation works. So, Attorney Nadler, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. So, just tell us a little bit about your background, what led you into elder law and estate planning.
So I I finished college and I wasn't sure of direction. And my, at the time, my mother was working with different attorneys. And she said, well, if you're going to consider law school, why don't you go intern for legal aid? And I ended up legal aid senior law project. So it was all senior issues. And when I finished, I wasn't sure I was ready for law school. And so I ended up doing many different aging organizations. I worked for the Council on Aging. I worked for the Ombudsman program for a very short period of time and some of those organizations, and decided I really liked the aging piece. So I went and I got my graduate certificate in gerontology from Georgia State and my master's, and worked from then for about 5 years with the Department of Community Health. I was doing, or Department of Human Services, doing regulations. So personal care home regulations, nursing home regulations, all those kinds of detailed regs. And about my third or fourth year in, I went, nope, I actually do want to go to law school. And so I transitioned back. Stayed working at the Department of Community Health, and then did the law degree. And I think for me, the interest is that, with the senior community, you're not usually working with a single person. You're working with a family unit. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy the interaction and helping families feel settled. And that's what estate planning is for me, settling.
Yeah, very, very true. So I think, like I said, the fact that you have the certificate in gerontology really is a unique credential. So how do you think that has shaped your approach to working with families?
I think my understanding of the needs in gerontology is a very different understanding than someone who's just an estate planner. So an example I always give people is I don't do Medicaid planning per se, but I know when you need Medicaid planning. Mm-hmm. And so if you come in and you start talking to me and I'm like, it's time to do some Medicaid planning, I will send you to the right person, but it gives me an idea. The other piece is that, like, I understand because 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I don't know how long my graduate grade is now, we were talking about the housing crisis. Right. What are we going to do for the population when they age? Where are they going to go? What is that going to look like? Should there be assisted living on every corner like a gas station? And that has continued to be a discussion as communities arise, as population ages. What is this a reasonable area for people necessarily? Can they afford this? What other options are there? Are there homeless people? Another piece to this, and it's an interesting piece when you're doing planning, is, and it's a term that I don't know if you've ever heard, but elder orphan. And basically, an elder orphan is a senior, you know this, who has really no family. They have no close family. And for planning for them is very different because you have to get them through, well, who's going, it can't be just, a lot of them are like, I want to come do a will. And the first thing I always say to people is, do you have a healthcare directive? Do you have a power of attorney? Because to me, yeah, it's important to give away your stuff and feel like you've done that. But if you haven't planned who's going to make your decisions, when you don't have capacity, you're leaving that up in the air. And I just don't think that's a comfortable position for a lot of people. And
Right.
especially, as I said, the elder orphans, they're like, well, who should make that decision? Oftentimes I'm like, I can't answer that for you. We can talk through it, but I can't actually tell you who to put in that place. So it's an interesting piece. And when I was getting my gerontology certificate, that was something that was upcoming, of just
Hmm.
the number of people who don't have family. And so it's a different planning piece.
Yeah, that's very true. And I actually had not heard the term elder orphan. And wow, that is very heavy.
Yeah,
And you're right. And I do feel like sometimes we do see a lot of assisted living, and it's almost like they are on every corner now. I mean, they are being built at a very rapid rate, but of course, our aging population is growing at a very rapid rate. And even though the conversation was being had many years ago, I still feel like we are nowhere near ready for the population, and definitely the housing market is not ready. Most homes are not built for an aging population at all.
correct. That is absolutely correct. And those modifications sound like little things, but there's a lot of them if you're going to make that home accessible. And there's a lot of planning in terms of what's going to go into that. Um, on the flip side, I always tell people, when you talk about, again, about that government benefits or Medicaid piece, I don't know if this will continue. Well, some of those modifications don't count. So if you spend money on those modifications, you're not affecting your potential government benefits. Um, so those are those pieces that people don't really necessarily know, but you have to think through, and you want to think, in the future, not
Mm-hmm.
what do I need right now. You
Right
want to
now.
think, what do I need for 20 years from now, 25 years from now.
Yeah.
So it's a big difference, and the housing market is really. And the other thing that people don't realize is, and I'm sure you hear these terms thrown around, but people are like, well, I have Medicare, so that covers everything. Well, Medicare doesn't cover everything. And so to start people from the beginning about what is Medicare, what is Medicaid, and then an understanding that Medicaid is state by state.
Right.
So, when you talk about housing and assisted living and, modifying a house, you have to understand that you have to look at your own state regs. You can't call me and ask me what to do in New York because I don't know.
Mm-hmm. That's so true, and a lot of people don't know. I did a presentation this past Wednesday at one of the senior centers here, and even though the topic was downsizing, and of course it's geared to seniors, but we talked about some of the different types of senior living options. And one of the ladies, after it was over, she and I were talking, and she had some questions about assisted living and independent living. And when I said, you know, those are private pay, Medicare does not cover that. She said, so you have to pay out of pocket? I said, yes. I said, Medicare doesn't. And she was genuinely surprised about that.
Yeah, I have that
So,
conversation many times, especially again when I'm doing planning because it goes to that healthcare piece also. Like if you're doing a healthcare power of attorney and you look at the piece about capacity, some of the statements that I tell people to think about is when you say I want to live at home for my forever, think about the cost of that, you know, or you say I want to be here, understand you gotta process all of that in relation to what do you have and your family.
mhm, absolutely.
So
Well, I feel like we've walked around this question a little bit. So many people think estate planning is just about making a will. So, from your experience, what's the biggest misconception that people have regarding estate planning?
Well, there are a couple things. One is definitely that it's only a will, and I
Hmm.
never only do a will. As I said, I do the will. I try to get everyone to do a healthcare directive, a power of attorney, and then for the larger families, I do HIPAA releases. Even though you're going to probably do it again with your doctor's office, do that.
Right.
Um, the other thing is that, and I have to always tell clients this: this is still a document. So, as much as I want to make it a good document, I cannot cover every situation that is ever going to happen with your healthcare. So, people take those documents, they stick them in a binder, and they walk away. I've made my documents, I'm all good. Um, that's another very, very big pitfall is people don't realize you have to, one, give those documents. You have to share the healthcare directive with your doctor. You have to put the POA. Um, and then you really do need to talk to the person you appointed.
Hmm.
You know, if your sibling is going to be your healthcare directive and they don't know what your current wishes are, that document is not going to answer every question for you.
Right.
So it really, to me, I always say to people, the healthcare directive is a discussion starter. Like, start the discussion here, um, because for estate planning, for maybe if you're 21 and you're doing a document and it's going to change every 5 years. As you age, that document may not change every 5 years. You may really know what you want, and so you can probably tell someone your wishes. Um, and there are a couple other documents that you can add in. Like there's a document called Five Wishes. A lot of my clients want to do that. There is what's called a POLST, which is a physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment, but it's a
Okay.
doctor's form, right? And it's supposed to be that real end of life. You're diagnosed. You got 6 months to go. So those are some of the issues with estate planning that people don't really process completely, or they don't think about. Um, and then the other thing that's interesting is people don't understand what the documents are in terms of where they go. So, for instance, I always say to people, a POA is a living document, and
Hmm.
someone will look at me and I go, "What that means is if your family member passes, you can't go use their POA to use their bank account, right?"
That's right.
So that's a hard memory for people because people are like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I have a POA." I'm like, "No, no, your family members died. You can't go use your POA." On the flip side, with the healthcare directive and the POA does, unless you specifically state it, it's going to go into effect, right? The healthcare directive is really that document for you can't communicate. You can't say what you want. So um, I tell the story because it's funny. It was actually a Saturday morning, and I don't usually answer the phone, but I saw it was a client, and I just was like, why is she calling this early Saturday morning? And I answered the phone, and she was frantic, and she's like, I can't get upstairs. My mom's upstairs in the hospital. I can't get upstairs, and I'm like, okay, calm down. What's going on? Did you tell the hospital that you're the healthcare agent? And she said, yes. And I said, well, why isn't the hospital letting you up? And she said, my mom said I can't come up. And I was like, yeah, okay. I said to her, hang on. The healthcare agent doesn't override your mom's decision. I said, your mom can still say you can't come up just because you're the healthcare agent. So a lot of people want to put more power in those documents than they have. Um,
Yeah.
so they are important, and you definitely should do them, and I think everyone should have them. But they're not going to necessarily for healthcare in particular, they're not going to override someone's ability to say no, I don't want this.
Right, because the healthcare agent is the person that is named in the healthcare directive. Is that correct?
Correct. And so
Okay.
they're really the person. If you don't have capacity,
Right, you can't speak. You're in a coma. You can't speak for yourself. Okay.
that's when the healthcare agent comes in. Not because you're downstairs and you want to go upstairs from the hospital and your mom said no.
Right, right. And you're right. A lot of people, even with the power of attorney, A lot of people think that they can make decisions. I did a video about that because it's like, well, I'm the POA. Well, once they pass away, that POA is null and void. It doesn't. People think that I'm the power of attorney. They pass away. Now I'm the executor. They think it just rolls right into now I take over from here,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it does not.
It does not. And I often remind people that, in the language of the power of attorney, it says this is a living document. This is not um, you haven't just, granted yourself for the rest of your life the ability of your life, not your parents' life, the ability to make decisions for them. And the other thing with these documents that people don't understand is, and I'm sure, as you mentioned, I do guardianship and conservatorship, is people like, okay, well, I have these documents, so there's never going to be a guardianship or conservatorship involved. Because the documents have a piece to check off who you'd want.
Okay.
And I always tell people, we're doing the documents with the hope that you're never going to have a guardianship or conservatorship, but there are family matters, family issues that come up where guardianship and conservatorship still need to come into play. I had a client very, very, I think it was 10 years ago already now, who was trying to revoke all her powers of attorney. She was mad at her daughter at the time, and she was going to revoke everything. And so her daughter came to me, and I said, we have to file for emergency guard. Some attorney is going to help her revoke that, and then you'll have no ability to help her. And so even though all the documents were in play, we had to go through the guardianship and conservatorship because she just... So the other thing that people have to know is those are revocable documents. Someone can decide, I don't want you in charge anymore. And
right. And it sounds like in that case, the daughter really did need to be in charge, and the mother was angry because of the decisions that the daughter was making, which were in her best interest. Wow.
yeah, she was... I shouldn't laugh. She was actually calling the police. She was in assisted living, calling the police saying, my daughter's locked me here. I can't leave. And the police would show up and they'd be like, you're not locked in. You're in assisted living. This isn't a jail. And so, she had to take the next step.
Right.
But it's not estate plan documents, as I said, are not you're done for the rest of your life. Everything's perfect. The other thing is I tell people every 3 to 5 years, pull out your documents. I was doing a presentation, and after the presentation, someone came up and she said to me, do you think I need to redo my documents? And I said, why are you asking? She said, well, everyone's kind of deceased now who's in the documents. And I said, yes, you need to redo. I said, all your beneficiaries have passed? And she said, yes. She goes, and the executors. I'm like, yeah, let's go redo your documents. So I kind of remind people every 3 to 5 years, pull them out, look at them, make sure these are still the decisions you want. These are still the people you want. The person you have nominated as executor isn't deceased or isn't now incapacitated, so that you make sure those documents didn't get done in vain. And so it's important.
Yeah, very, very important. Well, the conversation about the daughter and mom made me think about, so you put a post up on LinkedIn, and that's kind of how we got connected. And for me, it was something that I feel like I don't see very often when, people talk about estate planning. I can't think of anyone besides you that I've seen post anything about disinheriting an heir. So, like I said, that's how we kind of connected. So let's talk about that. So is it common that people disinherit their heirs? And I guess, what are some reasons, and what do people need to know when doing that?
So it is more common than you think it is. And it's usually relationship. So, I did a will recently for someone, and she said, I haven't talked to my brother in 25 years. I don't want him having anything from my estate. And so we put specifically in there, my brother and I have not, have no relationship other than biological, I think was something like that, or we have no continued relationship. I do not want him to inherit anything from my estate. Um, Sometimes, you disinherit for, and I hate to say it, the one kid who has caused problems, or the other one is the kid who already got lots throughout their life, and you're trying to make sure that the rest of the kids kind of get back to even. Um, and so it's important, the words, you know, I don't recommend putting in a whole, like, okay, I'm going to say you did this and this and this, because what I always remind people is it's a public document. You don't want to write in your will everything bad that this person did for you. Um, so one of the families, what we wrote was, I've disinherited my children, this child, and I've disinherited their children, and they all know why. So that, there isn't the question. But, it is, I recently did it was contested, but I recently did a will contest where the person had no kids. She had no close family. She left everything to her friend, who was also her caretaker, who was also her guardian. And a cousin came back and contested the will. And she had put in the will, if my guardian is, if my caretaker or my friend is not alive, then, my cousins can inherit. But she was very clear that they were only if this person wasn't alive. So in my mind, I'm like, well, she recognized them, and she recognizes she wasn't giving them anything. They did end up contesting the will. But, I always tell people, when I talk to people, I'm like, you don't legally, spouse different. And minor kids are probably, spouse and minor kids are a different story. But in general, you don't have the right to someone's inheritance. Like there's not something that says, oh, you have a right because you were a daughter, or you have a right because if you're an adult. And the reason I say a little different with spouse and minor children is, in Georgia, there's something called year support.
Mm-hmm.
And you can file a petition for year support. The idea is that you don't want a spouse and minor children, to not get when there are debts, right?
Right.
So that's really the idea behind year support. But in general, you can pretty much disinherit anybody you want, because, again, it's your money. You get to leave it to who you want. So I've seen it at, it does often lead to will contests. There is, so you want to word it particularly well. You also I always say to someone, does this person actually know that you disinherited them? Because you want to make sure they do, if you can. And if you're not speaking to them, make sure your executor knows that you disinherited them. Just because you don't want anyone to argue that was coerced, or it was undue influence, or, you didn't know what you were doing. And those are the reasons to contest. So you want to try to make sure that's covered in advance. Sometimes, if you're disinherited, there really is nothing you're going to be able to do about that. And that's often the case. So you want to know what you're doing when you do it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just because someone contests a will doesn't mean that the will becomes null and void. The will still stands. They're really just, for example, the cousin that you mentioned, it was clear in the will because the person did make reference to when they would then become the heir. So that makes it clear that they knew exactly what they were doing. They did not forget they had this cousin lingering out here. So, and being that a will is public knowledge, I would just think, if it was me, if I read that would just say to me, well, he or she was aware, and no need in me spending money to go get an attorney to try to contest this will?
Sadly, it took us over a year to get that settled. um, yeah, it took us over a
Really?
year. Um, because there was some, because they already had a caregiver and it was a friend and caregiver. um, he argued, well, she didn't have capacity, she was unsure. I had actually made sure that the caregiver, I said to her, you're going to send her to this, this friend. I said, you've been her friend for 20 years, you're not going to be involved in the will writing, you're going to send her to this attorney and let this attorney handle it. So we would have eventually won. We ended up working it out somewhat. But the interesting thing is when we were doing pre-litigation deposition, is what they're called, pre-litigation depositions, I asked him, I'm like, when was the last time you talked to her? And he goes, it was, and he goes, 2019. And I'm like, that was 6 years ago. You haven't talked to her in 6 years and you think she should still be handing you her estate. Like, so people have a very entitled sense when it comes to family money, even if that's not how it should necessarily go.
Right. That's very true. People really, really do. And unfortunately, I myself have seen it way, way too often. Well, so here in Georgia, just to be clear, if someone wants to disinherit a spouse or a child, are there any state laws that could override that person's wishes?
That's that spousal support and your support.
The spousal support. Okay.
Yeah,
But that's
your
for a
support,
spouse and minor children.
minor children. Minor children. Now, I will say the largest contest of your support is adult children from a previous marriage or adult children who often contest. And it has to be, it's usually contesting the amount. Like they're like, they don't need this much money. But it is the highest when you go down of who gets money, your support's at the top, and it's because they want that spouse and those children, minor children,
Minor.
covered, before debts get paid. But you still, all of that said, you still can disinherit. I was trying to think, in the last 5 years, I've done 2 year supports. That one of them we decided to drop because it just, we agreed we couldn't. She'd already had a lot of support at that point. Actually, 3. But one of them I actually won, and one of the reasons I won was the wife had, her daughter was her caregiver. She'd left the house because of their relationship, and he was applying for spousal support, your support, and we went through all of it, and the judge was like, she hasn't been supporting you in over a year, and he was, the court's like, I'm not giving you your support just because you're the spouse. So there is a way to disinherit a spouse, but it can't be, again, if that spouse that was counting on you and has minor children, not so easy.
Not so easy.
I told a woman once when she was working on her will, she said, I want to disinherit my spouse. I said, why? And she's like, and I forgot what country he lived in, but he didn't live in the United States. She's like, we haven't been together in 5 years. I said, go right ahead. She's like, I want to leave the house to my child. And it turned out her child was a special needs child. And I'm like, I don't think the court's going to pull that from your special needs child.
Right.
So you can, it's more difficult, as I said, if it's your current spouse, everything's, normal, or your children, your minor children.
So what advice would you give to anyone when they are considering disinheriting an heir? What, I guess, steps should they take, or things that when you're writing this up or preparing, that you're sure to include or say or not, or even not include?
So one of the things I always tell people is, this doesn't necessarily do with even disinheriting, is if you want to decide how your assets are divided, you have to do a will. You can't just hope that, because people don't realize, they're like, well, I'm not married, so it's going to go to this person. And I'm like, no, Georgia has a law, and this is how the law goes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that brother you don't like, if they're a living relative, that's it's going to go to them, if they're the next in line.
Right.
So if you are wanting to disinherit, what I say to people is, one, come with at least know, give me their name, let me know why. Um, I do ask families who have, no family, or if they're disinheriting the whole family, at least give me those families' names, because then when you do come to probate, they are. And the other thing I tell people is, they are going to get notice.
Mm.
They're going to get legal notice. So you have to know that in advance, so that I don't want my client thinking, oh, I disinherited them, they'll never know anything about my estate, because that's not the truth. So that's important. Um, and then, obviously, as I said, know where, if you're going to disinherit your family, well, who are you giving the money to? Um, because if you walk in here and you say, I want to disinherit everyone in my family, and then you say, and I don't know who I want to give it to, I'm going to send you back and say, come back when you figure that out.
Right.
But in general, most people know where they want their stuff to go and who they want their stuff to go to. But if you want to, and the other thing that I always say to people is, if you're going to disinherit someone, especially if it's a child, again, remember to take that will out every 3 years, because your relationship in 3 years may not be the relationship you have right now.
Right. That's so true.
So,
The hope is that the relationship has gotten better. Yeah.
right, right. And that, I mean, and relationships do change. So you really
Mhm.
keep that door open. So keep that document somewhere where, if you needed to make an update, you can. Um,
Okay. Okay.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. Well, one of the other things that stood out about you is that you are a probate litigation attorney. And you don't hear that often either. And I think most people are familiar with, probate attorneys. But what is a probate litigation attorney? Explain the difference and exactly
So
what you do.
what I do. So again, you've gotten your will, and most people, and this is something I should have mentioned earlier, is most people are like, I want to avoid probate. I need a trust. And what I tell people is, in Georgia, it's not really that difficult of a process, especially if you have a pretty standard family. I mean, if you're married, and it's, two kids and everyone gets along, even if there might be some, I don't need to do a 20-page trust for you to probate. But on the flip side, what someone who does probate litigation does is, you file that petition and someone files a contest. Um, the other one that I do litigation on is, you file the probate, you're ready to finish, and someone says, nope, I didn't get what I was supposed to get. I want a full accounting. So I spent, not last week, but the week before, 2 days arguing with, actually, it was over the accounting and the attorney's fees, between a family. And it was a very, I every time I finished, I was like, both days, I was like, why are we here? Because it was siblings,
Mm.
half, not step siblings, and the brother who was the executor had and this is another thing that's important, had a joint account with rights of survivorship with his dad. And a joint account with rights of survivorship, as you can guess, means, just like a house,
It goes to the son.
it goes to the son. My client was very nice. He took his dad's half instead of keeping it, and put it in the estate. And so I was like, you, you got extra money that you didn't even deserve. Why are you contesting? Um, so that's what I'm saying. Like, each time I thought, why? Um, but on the other side, you do have the cases where you're litigating, should someone have done this will? Did they have capacity? Did they understand what they were doing? Were they coerced? So all of those come into play. Um, I just started on a case that looks like there was definitely some coercion. You know, sisters brought dad, who already had dementia, to an attorney and was like, sign here, you know. Um, and I don't know that the attorney realized she was getting a sign here. Um, but, not all attorneys do it the same way. Not all attorneys say, hey, let me make sure you really know what you're signing. Um, but that's where litigation comes in. So, and then, so your support sometimes gets, as I said, sometimes gets litigated, um, either because they say it's in excess. Occasionally, someone says, "Well, that's not one of those. That child isn't one of their child."
Mm.
Um, we luckily this one, and I'll tell the story because I can tell it. But we ended up mediating this and negotiating it and working it out without getting to litigation, which was nice because we were headed in that direction. I got hired by the girlfriend who had two adult daughters and ready to go forward and file a petition for them. And another attorney emails me and he says, I'm representing the wife and her adult kids. And I was like, okay, we have a problem. And he had fully two families going. And so to figure out how to nicely divide up the state while still recognizing that, and neither the wife didn't know the other family existed until he passed. So to divide the assets up, there was a lot of back and forth, and I thought we were going to end up in litigation, but it was too good. I should toot my own. It was two attorneys good in terms of their intentions, and so we both try to get the family to recognize that no one was at fault except maybe him.
The person at fault was gone.
Right. And so do we really want to get to litigation? And it's funny because, people watch all these TV shows and they see all these things that are usually criminal cases. And when you watch a TV show, it goes to trial, and most cases, and that includes probate, you end up mediating. You end up sitting down. You get someone who's not on both sides to try to negotiate it. But that's what probate litigation usually involves: is you're contesting the estate, you're contesting either who is in charge, you're contesting whether the person had capacity to write that will. There are limited reasons to contest a will. So people think occasionally you'll see someone who doesn't have a lawyer writes, I don't agree with this will. And I'm like, that doesn't do anything for you. That's not a legal contest. So there are limited reasons. So it's, as I said, it's the capacity, the undue influence, fraud. So if you a fake will, but it's not everything. And so there aren't a ton of people who litigate probate because it's nuanced and it is kind of specific in terms of what are the responses, what are the reasons. As I said, the person who wrote, I wrote a response back to the court and said, that's not a reason to contest the will. I'm going to ask that you dismiss the caveat. And of course, on that one they did. So it's sort of a puzzle piece. What's interesting is because probate court also does, I just laugh when I say this, guns and marriage licenses. Mm-hmm. So people assume probate court's kind of something, oh, you can do that. That's easy. And especially in guardianship cases, I often have attorneys come in who don't practice in the area, and they're like, come in and they think they can just, and I'm like, this is still full court. We're still holding court here. So you still have to put on evidence. And that's the same thing with the probate litigation. You have to put on evidence. You have to prove your case. You have to get through all the pieces. So it's still a full process, just like any other courtroom. And so the assumption is that, you're not, or some people assume that probate isn't real litigation, and it is. It's a full,
Hmm.
um, but it is very specific to probate law. Um, they still follow the civil rules, so like there's still the other thing. There's still discovery kind of things. There's still deposition. There's still all those things. Um, the other thing, and this is a Georgia thing. I don't know that every other state does this. Is in the metro area, the probate attorneys are all judges. When you get
Hmm.
out of the metro area, they don't necessarily have to be judges. Not judges, attorneys. So the,
Attorneys.
so they are not necessarily attorneys in smaller counties, and the metro counties you can do a jury trial. The outside counties you can't do a jury trial if you're in probate court because again, some of those judges are not actually attorneys. Um,
And I feel like I read that before as well.
mhm.
But if they don't have to be attorneys, is there still a certain criteria that they have to meet?
Not, I'm not actually sure exactly what it is. I don't. It's less than I will say they obviously get a lot less cases.
Right.
So, and they get a lot less litigated cases. Um, I was involved in a case in, I'm trying to remember what county. I think it was south, far south. That judge was actually an attorney, but when we started talking about the case, she said, "Everyone stop. I actually know some of the parties, so I have to excuse myself
She had
because
to. Hmm.
she's like, it's a small town. I know everybody and I know some of these parties and I just don't feel like, and so we had to move the case. But it was just a funny kind of like, I'm like, oh, well, alrighty then. That makes things different. Um, it is this, as a Atlanta attorney in a smaller county, sometimes it's hard because they don't necessarily have all the law behind them. I have to remember that if I'm going to go litigate something in a smaller county, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a given that they'll understand all of the pieces. Um,
Gotcha. Mm.
but I tend to stay metro. I mean, as I say that, I just filed in, I think I filed in Gordon Hall and Polk in the last week. So I guess I don't always stay metro. Um, just like I said that, but that's not completely true. But I enjoy, litigating wise, I do tend to enjoy the bigger counties only because, you know, they're doing it every day. They have lots of
Hmm.
cases that are being litigated as
Right.
opposed to,
They know the process, and this the process that you're accustomed to is the process of the law. So really, in as a probate litigation attorney, you could be on either side. You could be representing the person that is contesting the will, or you may be representing the executor who is being, I guess, sued, so to speak.
yeah.
Okay.
And I've been on both sides. Um, the in general, the nice thing about probate, the probate bar, the people who practice in probate, because there's often, even in litigation, there's often multiple parties and multiple attorneys. We tend to be a fairly congenial group because we pass things back and forth. You
Hmm.
know, um, on guardianship cases, I've been in a guardianship case where there's 5 attorneys in the room. You know,
Wow.
um, there's an attorney because on a guardianship case, the person who is what we call the proposed ward, the person who they're trying to get guardianship over, they have a court-appointed attorney. Often the families both multiple sides of the families will have their own attorney. Sometimes there is what's called a guardian ad litem, someone who's supposed to
Hmm.
not be an advocate but in the best interest. So, I mean, when you have that many attorneys, you're going to be passing things
Right.
back and forth. The other thing is that, for me, I have an ethical rule. If I do, for instance, if I do your estate planning, if I do wills for you, I'm not then going to go represent your kids on a guardianship against you.
Right. That makes
So, I have attorneys call me and they go, I did the will for this person. The kids want to talk about guardianship. Can I send them to you? And I'm like, sure. So we do tend to pass back and forth. Um, so I think in general we tend to be again a bar that tries to work together, which is not all, again, not something everyone sees with attorneys.
Right. Yeah.
But
True.
yeah, I think we try to be good to each other because we know we might see each
We're gonna
other.
cross paths again. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So if a family suspects that there was undue influence over someone's estate, what steps should they take?
So with undue influence, a lot of that is to make sure you have if you see it starting, start documenting, start getting those documents together, start following that. Um, I'm litigating a case right now. The family, these again, stepbrother, um, came into the facility while dad was in memory care and took him out, took him to the bank, and had him sign checks. And when I say memory care, I mean a locked memory care. Like he didn't remember what he was doing. He didn't know what he was doing.
You didn't.
Um,
Mhm.
she made sure, luckily, to document, you know, all of the pieces. So she kept the caregivers' names. She made sure to, you know, keep the facility involved. That case actually ended up with an open case, um, but you know, it's start documenting when you see it, because you may not be able to go in and say, hey dad, I think this person, because they may not be talking to you. They may have decided this is their godson, this child's their wonderful child. um, so that is really it. If you can you can start documenting. The other thing is you're going to want to contest if that will gets, all of a sudden they have a will that doesn't
Mhm.
seem right. You're going to want to look at an attorney and consider whether you want to contest. um, because undue influence is one of the biggest ones. Capacity and undue influence, I think, are the two probably that most people look towards. uh,
Mm.
and undue influence is, it can be pretty clear sometimes. All of a sudden the will leaves only this person, again disinheriting everybody else, and only this person is inheriting. um, or the documents had both siblings as co executors, co trustees, co everything, and all of a sudden it's just one sibling.
The one. Mm.
um, and a lot of undue influence isn't necessarily even just the coercion of just that piece, it's the undermining. So it's the in the ear kind of thing to the parent of, oh, this person's doing this, or this person's doing that. um, I just I ended up getting out of this case because the person, I was actually court appointed, and they ended up, it was a guardianship case. And we're not even at the stage, but I think he will disinherit his daughter, which is sad. um, and the brother just kept telling dad, she's trying to get your money, she's trying to get your money, she's trying to get your money, and she's trying to put you in a nursing home, none of which was true. And the reality was the brother was taking money, but dad didn't see it. And so after, if you hear it over and over and over again, and the best thing for that is just keep trying to, do whatever you can to mitigate that undue influence. So
Mm.
have other cousins, have other friends. If you can't get to that person, trying to slowly listen in, trying to, stay involved. Um, because at that point, a lot of people get cut out.
Right. Yeah.
So, which is sad.
That. Yeah. I was gonna say that. That is sad. That is sad. Wow. Hmm. So, from your experience, what would you give? What advice would you give families to avoid probate litigation and to ensure that their estate or their will is held up in court?
So one is, and not tooting my own horn, don't do legal Zoom, don't do it online, don't get some, random person. Um, when you do have an older couple who are mixed marriage, this is
Mm-hmm.
marriage two for both of them, and they have children from previous marriage. I always recommend, do your documents, but also make sure that both sides of the family know what's going on. Um, and you have to really think about some of the, when you're writing the will, some reasonableness aspects, I would say. I had a couple miss second marriage. Yes, they came into the marriage, he had a lot more money, but they had been married 25 years and he was still trying to protect the money for his kids. And I finally looked at him and I'm like, so you're, after 25 years of marriage, you want to just leave her on the street if you die first? And he was like, well, no. And I said, so let's figure out how to put one of your children and one of her children together to determine whether, you know, how the
Mhm.
money gets spent and how this happens. Um, so I think, the knowing what you're doing in terms of being with an attorney. I also tend to tell people, when you're looking at estate planning or and doing wills, just because someone did your closing on your house doesn't mean they should write your will. Um,
All
it,
attorneys are not created equal.
and I'm not trying to be mean, but for a couple who's young and their will's going to change again 5 times, that's different. But when you're talking about a senior, you want to make sure your will is done well. Um, if long-term care insurance or Medicaid or any of those things are going to come into play, talk to someone, because your estate may start to dwindle down, and all of a sudden now you're the kids are fighting over because there's very little,
Mhm.
pieces. Um, Someone once told me, and we were writing their will, and she said, well, I said something about, do you have specific things, very specific things you want to leave to anyone in the will? I'm going to cover the rest. And she was like, oh, no, I taped everyone's name to the bottom of the objects of what I wanted everyone to get. And I was like, okay, that was one way to deal with it. Um, what I tell people is, there's a paragraph that's going to be in my wills that say, if you see a piece of paper attached to this and it's specific items, honor that because it's part of the will.
Mhm.
But it gives people the ability to change, because that is some of the other stuff that causes a lot of litigation is, that was, this was special to me and that was special to, um, again, talking about those courtrooms. I was in a courtroom once and there were 5 attorneys, I think, and they're going back and forth and they were arguing over who's getting the family photo albums and what to write on the headstone. And I thought, well, there's not going to be any money to write anything on the headstone when you're done paying all these attorneys.
Yeah.
Um, so I think a good will is always important. I think you have to really think through, if you're going to disinherit somebody or if you're going to leave different percentages, make sure you've covered your bases and really think through what you want to say. Um, and sometimes I tell people, if you're going to disinherit someone, write a letter. Stick it behind the will. Even if you think they know why, write it. It's not going to be part of the will, but at least it's something that they will know. Um, so I think that's probably the biggest piece of advice in terms of not contesting. The other thing that, I often say to people, there was a state, I ended up not finishing this one because for reasons that you will hear, um, I was representing, the granddaughter called me and she said, Grandma redid her will and pretty much everything is left to me and my brothers are left out. Turned out one of her brothers was an attorney, one of the brothers was here, and it got very, very nasty very quickly. And I can handle nasty, but sometimes I'm like, it's just not necessary. And she said to me, well, I was going to give my brothers money, but Grandma left it to me. And I thought, and she had talked to Grandma when writing the will, and I thought, you should have just let Grandma be and let Grandma leave that to
Mhm.
them instead of, trying to pressure Grandma to just let you be the good guy. Um, and I guess, to be honest with you, they ended up in a jury trial and the jury agreed. Um, so
Mhm.
those kinds of things, like, there's got to be some be realistic about some things, um, and again, you don't have to leave your money to anyone, but if you're not going to, make sure you've really made it clear for yourself why you're doing it. Maybe write that letter to that person who you're leaving out, so they understand. Um, Sometimes, and this is hard. I've done a few wills where I've left older or younger sibling over other siblings' trust. On those, make sure you're really detailed. Make sure you tell that sibling what they're paying for, what they're not paying for.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise you're opening that up to future litigation. It If you have no direction and it says, hey, pay your sister when you think it's appropriate, that's not
Right.
going to work. That's not going to work. Add some language in there to give them some direction.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were talking about the client that said she, pretty much put the name or she taped who she wanted to have what, that makes me think about, so what would be your suggestion? Someone passes away. What are the steps, I guess, that the executor should take to try to ensure that things don't go missing before they have the right? Because it's always the stuff,
Mm-hmm.
mom has passed away and, oh, there's the dish over there, I'm going to, well, I'm gonna go ahead and take this now, or well, this was a necklace, she said I could have it, and these things start
Mm-hmm.
disappearing.
So there are a couple things. One, I always remind people, and this is something people don't realize, they're like, well, I'm the executor. And I'm always like, you're the nominated executor. Until you're officially appointed, you're not executor. But on the flip side, if you start seeing issues or there are going to be issues, there is a petition for a temporary administrator. And that temporary only job is to marshal the assets. So to protect. And so, with a client, I just told her, she said to me, my brother keeps going in and taking things. He just keeps taking things. And I said, change the locks. And she's like, I'm allowed to do that? I'm like, oh yeah, you're executor, go change the locks.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, I tell people, and a lot of my clients do listen. I'm like, all right, so dad has a safe. You're worried about it getting stolen. That's fine. You want to take it out of the house, but go straight to the bank and have a bank employee, while you put it in the safety deposit box, make an inventory. In today's world, walk around with a video camera, video
Yes.
all the stuff, take pictures, make sure everything is there. It's really you have a lot of options in today's world on how to get it ready. And some of it's just going to be hard. I had a family, and this was a very sad story. Dad was actually killed in a drive-by.
Mm-hmm.
The mother of his children they were not married, they weren't living together, and his siblings went in and started taking things out, and his mom out of the house. They were like, well, there are things. And I said, call the police. I said, if you have to, call the police. And they will say it's a simple thing, but at least you've got it started they know. The other thing is get an attorney very, very quickly on those cases, because that way you have an attorney writing to them and saying, you can't just take things from the house.
Right.
But the best way is to inventory. And then if someone has written a list, it's very helpful if you can quickly get that list, put it away, and have it. The other thing is you may need to get appraisals on things. I just had someone, and on a case that I'm working on, their dad had a coin collection, hundreds of thousands of dollars in coins. And I was like, I didn't know coins could be that much, but okay. So when I ask people, like in general, when I ask people to do a list for me of what their assets are, I have a blank that says, do you have any collections? Because you'd be surprised what people have collected that's worth a lot of money. So I do, it, those pictures, that inventory, the appraisal, those are all important. But if you have to, you can go get temporary letters of administration and just, I'm temporary administrator, I have to change the locks.
Gotcha. That that's a good answer there, because I feel like that is something that I hear a lot about is, this person is the executor, and, they're telling me, oh, well, so and so is coming in and out of the house and they've taken this and that. And, we're still waiting on, letters of administration to even be able to move forward. And people are, so that's good to know.
And the
Um,
temporary, the court usually has those hearings fairly quickly. I mean, is it the next day? No, but it's usually fairly quickly because they know that that means there's some question about is something being
mhm.
removed from the estate that shouldn't be.
Right, exactly. Well, for those watching who may not have an estate plan, where's the best place for them to start?
In terms of if they want to hire someone or
Yes, or just preparing if they were going to make an appointment. What are some things they want to gather, to take, to have, to bring with them, or be able to share on a consultation call?
and I do. I think I mentioned this to you. I do free consultations only because you may talk to me and realize I'm not, and I don't say I'm a good match for everyone. So lots of people think I'm a good match, but not everyone. So I do a free consultation. I want to know when someone's talking to me, do they have previous planning documents? I want to know basic family setup. So is it mom, dad, and 5 kids? Is it mom and three, or not mom? Is it a woman and 3 dogs? Are we, because we may be doing a pet trust. Um, so those are the kinds of things that, kind of to prepare for the call, you need to be kind of, and then the other piece that, as I said, is think about who you want to make decisions for you, whether it's the healthcare decision, whether it's the financial decision, whether it's the executor role, whether it's taking care of your pets, your kids, whatever. You need to start thinking about that before you call. Because as I said, if someone calls and says, I have no idea, I can't do planning documents with no one in charge.
Very true.
I, you know, and that's true. I will tell you that the other thing is if someone calls me and they want to ask me some questions and they'll say to me, I'm going to call other attorneys, just a few other attorneys. I always say, dude, make sure you're with the right attorney to meet your needs. And sometimes I'll say, and here are other attorneys to call if you want to try some other people. Um, and the other thing is for me, I tend to be what I call it, a middle of the road attorney. I always laugh when I say this. If you're looking at an estate and you have $14 million and you need to do all kind of tax planning, I'm going to send you to someone else. I think I've only had one client that this actually, or one person this actually happened to. I'd say if you're on the low end, it may be that you don't. But I will tell you, as I said, I've only had one person I actually said don't do a will with, and she was a witness, and she said to me, "Do I need a will?" And I said, "Most people need a will. Why wouldn't you need a will?" I said, "You're living in a house." She goes, "It's rented." I said, "What about the car?" She goes, "It doesn't work." I said, "Do you have the bank account?" She knows, "So I live paycheck to paycheck." I go, "You win. You don't need a will." Um, kind of as a joke, but
Right. There were really no assets to transfer.
right. So for them, for that person, I wouldn't have been the right attorney either because, they don't really need much. Um, but lots of people hit that middle road and they need their planning documents done. They need to be able to put it away and say it's done. Um, but if you kind of put your stuff together in terms of thinking through those pieces, you're usually going to be ready to talk to an estate planning attorney and figure out next steps.
Okay.
So,
Well,
yeah.
I guess if someone is watching the video and they feel like you might be the best match for them, how could they contact you?
So my website is rainanadlerlaw.com. They can email me, which is Raina at rainanadlerlaw.com again. or they can call. And my numbers, I will say it, but I can make sure you have it. It's 678-779-6938. I answer texts, I answer phone calls. As I said, people call me up, look up me up on the website. My name is unusual, so the funny thing is, when you're looking for a lawyer, if for some reason, let's say you're not looking for me, the Georgia bar does have a find a lawyer. So you can get on the bar site and type in a specific name, like if you typed in Nadler. So if you do the NAD, I think even if you just do the NAD, you're going to end up with me. There may be a few other NADs, but it gives you some ways to find an attorney. But if you want to contact me, those are my contact information. Definitely, you have my information, um, and I'm
And I
happy.
can co-sign on the fact that you are a very prompt responder because I did reach out through your website and you responded very promptly to my message.
Part of
So
my ethics. I feel like people want to be, people want to know that you're listening. So, um,
absolutely,
but
absolutely.
yeah, I'm happy to help anyone. And this was great. This was
Yeah, I've definitely enjoyed it. And is there anything that we haven't talked about that you are like, I wanted to be sure I said that today? Can you think of anything?
not off the top. I think the only other thing to know, and I think this is actually statistically why sometimes I share this statistically. I think there's 62% of people who don't have an estate plan in the
Mm-hmm.
population. And one of the main reasons is that if you do an estate plan, all of a sudden you're talking about dying, and you're putting your. And I always say to people, nope, this is not. You're not setting yourself up to die. You're setting yourself up to take care of yourself because you're giving yourself peace of mind that you now have that person who can step in on any of the roles you need. If you're incapacitated, you have someone. So I always say to people, it's important, and it is not you. You're not saying, "Oh, I'm dying tomorrow." You're working with living documents as well.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, you're right. People think about, oh, it's kind of like I don't want life insurance. I don't want to think about that. That means, I'm going to no, with the estate planning, to me, it's really a license to live. You've taken that off your plate. You
Mhm.
have everything laid out for the people you love. And I also think it's a great gift to give your family,
It
you
is.
know, so that they don't have your voice has been heard. They know exactly what you want in the
Mhm.
event that you can't speak for yourself or. So I actually think it's a gift.
It is. It is.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Well, as I said, this was great. I appreciate the opportunity.
Same here. Same here. So